So what does the Senate do now?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Of course, we don't have full articles of impeachment voted on by the full House yet. That mostly comes next week. If you're seeing this show originally on its original air date, December 12th, you may see this again a couple of times during the holidays because the Senate is not going to convene on impeachment until January, and the basic principles of discussion with my terrific guest will remain intact. Great to have you aboard. Thank you very much for tuning in this evening. Interesting day on this particular original air date, December 12th, where the real meat of the arguments between the Democrats and Republicans in House Judiciary was vetted. I mean, it began on Wednesday evening and started in the markup of the actual resolutions of impeachment was really happening today. If there was any time that Americans should have been tuning in to the discussion, it was today. I don't know. We'll have to check the ratings. But here's what the network had. Well, here's the headline on the whole discussion, and here's what the network had as of press time in the early afternoon.
President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by...
A clerk for the Judiciary Committee began Thursday's hearing reading the impeachment resolution into the record.
In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry.
The committee is considering two charges: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The abuse of power article argues President Trump corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into a political opponent.
He conditioned release of vital military assistance on President Zelensky's investigations. And second, he conditioned a head of state meeting on these investigations.
Republicans call the Democratic-led proceedings corrupt and biased.
This committee has become nothing but a rubber stamp.
This is a day that will live in infamy.
Both sides are offering amendments to the articles, some big, some small, before the committee holds a vote.
This amendment makes a minor change in certain places where the underlying resolution refers to Donald J. Trump. The amendment refers to Donald John Trump.
This amendment strikes Article 1 because Article 1 ignores the truth.
Last night, the White House offered its most detailed defense yet for why it held up aid to Ukraine. A memo from the Office of Management and Budget explained that the freeze was temporary and part of a regularly used procedure to determine the best possible use of the funds. The full House is expected to vote on the articles of impeachment next week.
Yeah, but folks up the chain didn't know that as the testimony offered.
Exactly.
Boy, that's a little bit late in the game. Really? Interesting. By the way, the biggest political damage that was inflicted today, other than the concept of the president under this impeachment heat, was Hunter Biden. He's a victim, again, of his own circumstance and behavior, and Republicans who have no fear to take him on personally, personal problems, drug issues, that kind of thing, coming up in this hearing. So you know that there is a no-holds-barred atmosphere here, no doubt. I told you before, and I'll tell you again, I don't think Joe Biden survives this politically in 2020. We shall see. I've been wrong before, most every day on something. But that's why we bring smart people in here. Rich Arenberg returns. He's a professor of political science. He is an expert on the Senate, has written many pieces of literature on how to understand government. He hails from Brown and the Watson Institute and has worked for 3 senior senators in Washington over the course of a 3-decade career down there. Thank you, Professor, for coming back. Good to see you.
My pleasure to be here.
You're kind of my Senate guy.
Yeah.
Your expertise is in the Senate, and so I think what I'll do is postpone the travel of this case for the next segment. Let's do a 5-minute seminar, if we can, on what is most likely to at least foundationally happen in the Senate after the articles of impeachment are most likely to be approved next week.
Right.
The Senate is the trial.
Right.
This is the indictment. The impeachment's the indictment.
That's
the Senate
right.
is the trial. Give me your Cliff Notes on how this goes.
Okay. Well, as soon as the articles come over from the House, the Senate will begin its trial. Now, they may put it off until January, as you indicated. But once they go into the trial, they meet under the rules for 6 days a week. They continue all the way until a verdict is rendered. Now, that leaves a lot to be decided, and that's the situation with the Senate.
They've got their own discretion, correct?
That's right. There are 26 written Senate impeachment rules. However, they leave much more unanswered than they answer.
Such as?
Will there be witnesses? How many witnesses? Will they testify in public? Will they testify on the Senate floor? Will they testify to a committee of senators appointed by the Senate? All sorts of procedural issues like that. And in the past, those matters have been decided by the Senate adopting a resolution. Now, in the Clinton impeachment, that resolution was bipartisan. It was passed 100-0. The framework of, there was a lot of battle, but the framework of the trial was bipartisan, was agreed to by both sides, and in the end, everyone felt that it was a fair trial. It's much less likely to go that way this time.
You were on the radio with me yesterday and made a point to make a point, which I'm so thankful you did, because I don't think people are projecting this dynamic difference. We have seen a Donnybrook,
right,
literally, in the House of Representatives on both the Intel and Judiciary committees. And I'm guessing, timing being what it is, watching the show on its original air date, next week, it's not going to be pretty either on the House floor.
Right, I'm sure.
The Senate will hear this trial and, at least during its official proceedings, say nothing, correct?
Senators will say nothing, right.
Senators will say
right.
nothing.
That's right.
You've got the Supreme Court Chief Justice presides. You have House Democrats, perhaps even 1st District Congressman David Cicilline,
right,
providing the case.
As managers.
As
right.
managers. How many
right.
managers? As many as they want?
As many as they want. There were, I think, 13 for the Clinton impeachment, there, so it could be
delivering
somewhere
their aspect of the case to the jury, which is the Senate, which sits there silently listening to the evidence. They're not precluded from speaking outside the proceedings.
Right. That's right.
But
if they
you'll
want,
see it's a very different flavor.
If
much
they want to
more,
ask a question or make a motion, all of that has to be done in writing.
in writing to either the case manager or the chief judge?
Well, it will go to the presiding officer.
Now, can individual senators just write their question, or do they caucus to determine whether a question is legitimate?
No.
They can just write a question?
Right. Yeah, they could.
Huh. But the dynamic will be different. It'll be much more serious, much more solemn.
I think the Senate is concerned about protecting its dignity and at least projecting the appearance of a very deliberative process and a fair trial.
That rule that requires them to sit and speak is part of the 26, or is it a constitutional proviso, or is it flexible? Is it fluid?
Well, anything about this trial can be changed if the Senate decides to do it, and it takes only a simple majority. So they could pass a resolution that changed all of that. I think they're much more likely not to do that, to follow the precedents of the way that it's been done in the past. It's important to note that with the Chief Justice presiding, that means there's no, if there's a 50-50 vote on a matter, then it's defeated because the Vice President is not there to cast the deciding vote. And that could be important because if there is a big controversy over one of the resolutions, one of the decisions that McConnell would like to make, he's only got 53 senators on the Republican side.
So on that, you know what, we're going to pause here and come back a little bit more about procedure, but also strategy, because Mitch McConnell has telegraphed how he wants this to go. We'll be right back.
If we decide the president is above the law, then we will no longer live in a democracy. We will live in a dictatorship trading the values of Madison for the values of Moscow. That's why this should matter to every single person watching tonight.
You know, everyone's always looking for their key line. That one's kind of stuck.
Yes.
With, you know, social media and the national reporting. So David Cicilline is making kind of his mark. You know, David and I kind of laugh a little bit. It took Donald Trump perhaps for he and I to see eye to eye on some things. And so this whole thing is too much. Headline here: Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, is more than clear that he doesn't see any kind of conviction, but now is being more specific about how he wants to go about this. Moving to acquit means, in some shape or form, that he's not interested in hearing witnesses. That if you go to any court in the land,
right,
and ask for summary judgment on the part of the judge, it's like, okay, here are the arguments. I'm making a decision.
Yes.
I think that's what he's looking to do.
Yes, he's talking about a trial as short as 2 weeks. I believe the Clinton trial was 8 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And in order to do it that quickly, they will have to, when they pass the resolution, they will have to say that there will be no witnesses.
And again, that has to be approved by the majority.
It has to be approved by a majority.
Well,
Right?
the dynamic of 53-47, Republicans and Democrats, you know, at first glance might be, well, that's easy enough. It's not as easy. There are some swing state, and then there's Romney.
Right.
There's Romney and then swing staters.
Exactly.
Right?
That's
That you're going to
exactly
have
right.
to navigate through.
And you know, and in this instance, when we say swing state, we really mean a state in which Trump is not overly popular, where the Senate race is competitive, and where there is a Senate race this time. So states like Maine, Colorado, Arizona, North Carolina.
What is your take on? You're a big student and teacher on institution. The political bias that exists right now, the complete inability of Republicans or Democrats to see each other's perspective on this, has rattled the institution in a way that I don't think even the founding fathers thought would happen.
Right.
Do you agree?
Yes, I
don't
think
want to be
that's
so.
right.
I don't want to be catastrophic about that.
Yeah,
but
yeah. No,
do you think so?
I agree, and I really think we're in a phase right now where our democracy really is on the line. And it's not just about this impeachment trial, it's about the context of hyper-partisan polarization to the point where the two parties on Capitol Hill very often can't even get to the table. They're just not negotiating. The United States Senate has done virtually nothing this year except confirm judges at a very fast pace.
So, big picture, what's a more important principle here? Putting a guy in the hot seat, holding him accountable, indicting him, impeaching him, even though you know that the Senate's not going to convict.
Right.
To hold up what is the legislative oversight responsibility on the powers and the behavior of the president, or given the incredible bipartisan nature of this whole thing, the damage that's done by impeachment, I don't think the House ought to be operating in fear of what could happen should the president be impeached. But I think the temperament of the country, fractured as it is, will be worse or worser. And so what's the bigger principle? What is the bigger principle?
Well, I mean, I think that
These are the kind of things you academic types, you political scientists talk about all the time.
Well, let me put it this way.
But, I mean, do you think about that second stage of principle rather than the principle of the constitutional demand of the legislature to do what it has to do to check the executive?
Well, I think that's pretty fundamental. That's very much at the heart of our Constitution.
But if that heart of the Constitution is going to exacerbate a fracture of polar opposites that are built in prior, is there a bigger principle that we're missing here? Is there a bigger set of damage that's done?
Well, yeah, I think that it's at the very heart of democracy. When we talk about democracy, this presupposes that the parties will negotiate with each other, that will lead to some moderation, that will lead to some consensus, and that the country can then move forward and address its really big problems. Its really big problems are not being addressed at all, whether it's problems with infrastructure or immigration or the health policy or whatever major problem that you want to point to. Our political system is not coming to grips with that.
Yeah, I agree completely, but I'm less concerned with that, meaning doing the business of the country, than I am, not to steal a term from Joe Biden, which I think he's overusing, but the soul of the country. I'm worried about the soul of the country. The more I look at this in this immediate time frame, I'm thinking the Democrats have a story to tell. I think the president definitely abused his power without question. The substantial proof is hard to grab. Excuse me. This thing is just not quitting. It might have taken more time to make the case. The election's behind us, it's right in front of us, and the hatred is exacerbating.
Well, I think the House had no choice.
Excuse me.
I think the House had no choice. Speaker Pelosi recognized that, and they had no choice but to go forward with impeachment. I've always felt.
I'm double checking that one. No, I'm just. So there's no choice. Of course, they had a choice.
Well, yes. When I say no choice, I mean that overwhelmingly they had a constitutional responsibility to move forward on impeachment. I have always felt, by the way, that it's a bad idea for either party to go forward with a one-party impeachment in the House. That's what happened with Clinton. I always thought that was a bad idea. But what changed my mind in this instance, really, was when the president began to stonewall the Congress completely across the board.
That in and of itself is almost, I wonder, they stripped it down to abuse. We'll come back, we'll talk about that, because stripping it down to abuse of power and obstruction of Congress is now that the Republicans are saying this thing is so thin. It might have been good to go real thin, because there is one problem here that is irreconcilable. We'll be right back.
Over 275 bipartisan bills are sitting on the desk of the Grim Reaper, while he says all you're doing is impeachment. No, it's not all we're doing. We've set new bills that have not only bipartisanship in the House, but also in the country. For example, the bipartisan background checks bill supported by 90% of the American people. Why would the Republicans not want to protect our federal elections? To whose advantage is that blocking?
I got to tell you, my respect for her is risen by leaps and bounds. At the same time, what's the matter with her? Her constant references to Mitch McConnell as the Grim Reaper. That's Trumpian. What's the matter with her?
Yeah.
What is she thinking?
Yeah, I think it's
not smart.
It's out of step with the way that she's handled this whole affair, which I think has been really first rate.
Right?
Yes.
Someone on the Pulitzer side say, stop that. Clean it up. You're talking about cleaning things up. You went to your Catholicism and bristled over the question of hatred of the president last week. Okay, righteous indignation, your call. But stop with the kind of things that Donald Trump has done. labeling everybody by some nickname. Anyway, bribery, extortion, off the table, abuse of power, broad. Reminds me of Buddy Sancian when he went down. He went down not by predicate counts, but by really having responsibility for the whole thing. Jury said, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. But the big question, he knew something was going on. Guilty, right? Sent him in prison for 4 years. God rest him. That's kind of what the abuse of power thing is. But what is inarguable is that the president has not cooperated a lick, period, and Congress has the right to demand these things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That in and of itself is impeachable, whether it was a traffic ticket they're prosecuting him for or a murder.
I think all the evidence that you need for that article of impeachment is the letter that the White House counsel wrote on, I think it was October 8th.
Saying he wouldn't cooperate at all.
That's right. No documents, no officials testifying.
Cited the whole process to be unconstitutional.
That's right. And that is obstruction of Congress. It's disrespectful to the Constitution. It could not be allowed to stand.
Some would argue, well, the president has the right to use the third branch and go to the courts and defy and test the defying of subpoena. That's not necessarily true. Congress has a constitutional unlimited authority on issues of impeachment, does it not?
The Constitution says that the power of impeachment belongs solely to the House of Representatives, and the power to try that impeachment solely belongs to the Senate.
And so although there have been delays and there was movement to the courts and the Nixon and Clinton and, you know, and Obama on Fast and Fury didn't cooperate, well, Congress didn't react with penalty for not cooperating. But it has the ultimate authority. I don't know. This whole thing is going to be something else. I hope that you'll be around as this whole thing goes in the Senate. But what is your predictions are weird. What does your gut tell you the end of January is going to look like? Real quick, I have 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, I think the Senate will acquit. The Senate will acquit the president.
And quickly.
Right. Yes. I think it may not be the 2-week trial that McConnell wants. We'll see how much pressure builds up on him to back away from that a little bit. I think the president would like to see witnesses.
But by the way, he ain't coming.
No, he will not.
He's been saying he wants to come.
Yeah, no,
David Cicilline asking him questions.
It's very much like when he was saying he looked forward to testifying in front of Mueller. Yeah. It never happened, and it will never happen in this instance.
Thank you for your expertise. We'll touch back. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. All right, when we come back, a final word. Big show tomorrow night. Tomorrow night we switch away from impeachment and talk about the big development that is proposed for Pawtucket. It's a $400 million project. How real is it? Well, the guy who says he wants to do it and is going to fund most of it will be here to talk to us about it tomorrow night. Hope you have a great evening. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.